Chapter 17. Mallory stepped briskly as she exited the apartment, marching outside, still unhinged when she climbed into her Ford, hands shaking when she put the keys in the ignition, started the car, and angled it away from the curb and down the driveway into the traffic. She snapped her eyes closed for a second, hit the steering wheel and shouted, "What the fuck?" Then she gazed at her hands on the wheel. She couldn't stop from shaking even as she gripped the steering wheel tight. Breathing in and out, she focused on the road ahead, and drove on instincts as she careened through the slow traffic and onto Fifth Avenue. She still had a job to do, even if she had been unnerved by the two strange women. One dressed in black and white, the other somewhat dressed in a sheer sort of black gown as if preparing herself for bed. The pale-looking one, Sasha, had her uneasy when she declared that she was married to Jovani. It wasn't what she said, it was the way she said it, and proceeded to stare at Mallory. With a cold gaze never blinking. As if Sasha was a statue. Mallory wasn't intimidated when she walked into the apartment, but when she left, a cold and unexplained chill ran the length of her back. She couldn't figure out what it was. But she knew it had never happened before, and she would never allow it to happen again. Since Sasha was still with Tycia, Mallory thought this would be the perfect time to pay a visit to Jovani Nightingale. She had taken a liking to him, and disappointed to learn about his strange wife. At this point in her life where she encountered men who worked with her, and those that were dead, she didn't mind striking up a relationship with Jovani, especially since he was the most beautiful and handsome refined man she had known or met within the last 10 years of her life. When she was in her early 20s and her mother begged her to take up modeling, she had many chances to capture the hearts of all types of men, handsome playboys or domesticated ones, rich or poor, but she chose a profession that limited that possibility and her prospects of marrying unless she married a detective, and that had been out of the question for years since she had turned down most of them, and they had moved on and married, and now have young children, and here she is with none and toying with the idea to date a rich married man. This idea had been Mallory's, and by no means had Jovani thought about the notion of Mallory as a partner. All he wanted to do was entertain her with a few answers and send her on her way. He would amuse himself with answering questions he had answers to, but that was the extent of the relationship he wanted with her. Meeting Jovani's scary wife didn't alleviate Mallory's designs on Jovani, it only served to elevate her opinion that she would be a better partner than Sasha. If she made herself available, then maybe she had a chance, she thought, as she drove up the driveway to his apartment building. Wondering why he never mentioned his wife, Mallory parked her car in front and stepped out and into the glass and steel building. The security recognized her and smiled. She was still as attractive as she had been in her 20s. She had just made 30 and figured Jovani to be around that age too. Maybe in his late 20s but no older. Sauntering to the elevator, she watched as the young man at the security desk announced her arrival. The young man smiled and waved at her, signaling that Jovani was waiting for her. Mallory smiled back and entered the elevator. In a second she was stepping off the elevator and into the large hallway with its antique tables and vases filled with fresh flowers. She stooped to smell the yellow roses that had been placed near the door. When it opened, Jovani stood not with a smile. He rarely did, but his eyes lightened up, and so did Mallory's at the sight of him wearing a black robe over black silk pajamas. Wondering when she had seen a man such as him so beguiling and attractive, she answered her question. Never, she thought. She smiled at him as a woman would with a man she had just met and had just fallen in love with, and for her it had been love at first sight. Just as it had been for Jovani when he first saw Hannah. With Jovani, it was being human and polite. Being what he thought Mallory wanted. He knew by the look in her eyes she came for more than a visit and to ask questions of him. It wasn't to question him about the latest murders either. Most of which he knew nothing about, especially since the murders were young women. He thought the witch had a hand in most of it, but to lead Mallory to her would be to involve himself, and then someone would have to die, and he didn't want it to be Mallory. "Come in, detective." "Mallory, please," she said with a shy small smile as if she was being asked to the prom by a shy young man. She felt at that moment she had made herself look silly, but at this moment in front of a man she was more than attracted to, she didn't give a damn. If he had proposed to fuck her now on the floor, she would lay down on the hard flooring, open her legs, and let him do what he wanted because she was seriously in need of a fuck. And she couldn't think of a better man she would want to do it with. Standing facing Jovani, she said, "I have a few more questions to ask you." She glanced down in a shy way. A way she wasn't comfortable being, and Jovani noticed. Jovani raised a thick eyebrow, and his long dark lashes swept over his eyes as a closed smile crept out, showing his perfect white even teeth, except for the two long incisors she hadn't observed before. "Then why are you standing? Please come and sit down near me. I would ask you if you wanted a drink, but you said not on duty, and you're driving. Are you still on duty?" "No. And I'll have that drink." Her voice unsteady. "But you're driving?" "Yes, but I need it," Mallory said. By this time her intimidation by his beauty and status had worn off. Jovani strode to an antique cabinet setting in front of a floor-to-ceiling panoramic window, with a view of Manhattan at night. He reached for a glass and a decanter and poured the wine into the glass and brought it to her. She reached for it and took a full sip. Jovani sat down next to Mallory. He glanced at her hands and they were shaking. Her eyes followed his to her hands and she had calmed after the wine. Not like before. The wine had soothed her nerves. She drew in an even breath. "Thank you." She held the wine glass with both hands and took a mouthful. "What is it that's bothering you, Detective Mallory?" Mallory smiled at him and set the glass on the table in front of her. "It's your wife." Looking at him to gauge his reaction, she saw that Jovani became disturbed, but tried to cover it up. He stood and marched over to look out the window. "How do you know I have a wife?" he asked, facing the window, his back to her. His voice changed. Not easy or soft, but not hard either. "Are you saying you don't?" Her heart raced because she thought she had a chance with him. "No. I'm not saying that. I do have a wife, but we have been separated for years." The way he said years led Mallory to think that it may have been more than 5 years. And since he didn't give her a timeline, she concluded that it had been about 10 years. "You can't be that old, and if it is years? Were you married as teenagers?" Mallory had inadvertently provided Jovani with an excuse. "Yes, that's it." He turned to face Mallory. "She and I were teens and we never divorced." "Are there children?" "We could never have children." That wasn't a lie. It had been the truth that set Jovani on this path and made it possible for him to meet Hannah. Jovani thought Sasha would have a child with him before he turned her, and they would stop the needless desire for human blood and the carnage that arose because of it, where they would live without the stain of human blood on their hands and the nightmares of all that he had done, but Sasha had lied. She had no intentions of changing her habits. She enjoyed her ravenous appetite for blood and sex. Her only intentions were to get Jovani to kill the old vampire so she could be with Jovani and become his queen, where they would reign for thousands of years, killing and fucking whom they pleased. "I'm sorry." Mallory stood and walked over to Jovani. She gazed into his blue eyes and wished he would kiss her, but he didn't. She placed her hand on his face and he took her hand gently and placed it down to her side. "I see you would prefer to be alone. I'll ask you about, well, I'll leave that for another time." She turned and walked into the wide foyer with marble flooring and a large chandelier hanging overhead with a few bulbs in it. She looked up. The lights dim. She walked to the door and before she placed her hand on the knob she turned and smiled. "I prefer it that way," he said, smiling broadly. Once again she noticed his captivating smile. "Oh, I forgot to ask you one thing. Do you know Hannah St. John and Justin Samsa? It appears her roommate Gabriella called in a missing person. We have an Amber Alert out for her." And she turned before she could see the expression on Jovani's face. His eyes changed colors from a cool blue to a deep dark blue, and he tightened his fist and stared past her. So Justin had finally convinced Hannah that she would be safe with him. A werewolf, that's a laugh, he thought. I met them at a party. Mrs. Kellerman asked me to speak to her daughter and her friend, to show them what a billionaire looks like. Meaningless, isn't it? Mallory stopped at the elevator door. Not really. Young girls are fascinated by that kind of thing. They didn't appear awestruck by me. More like, why are you bothering us? Jovani grinned at the thought. They didn't have to be impressed by Jovani. Mallory was a matured woman, not a teenager. They no doubt couldn't see what she saw in him. He had all the necessary attributes to impress a woman, she thought. I'll talk to you another time, Mallory said with a grin. She stepped into the elevator. Anytime. But only at night. I work and sleep during the day, Jovani said. Mallory chuckled at the thought. She whispered, night? My favorite time. And the elevator door snapped shut. When the door closed behind her, she smiled with encouragement. It might take a little longer to get to Jovani Nightingale, but she had all the time in the world, she thought. And she would never give up until she got her man.